We finished off talking about risk aversion. Recall that people who are risk averse don't want to make a fair bet. We illustrated this concept in the lecture with an example of a producer who produces a conventional crop and is thinking of switching to organic, but viewed the switch to organic as risky. The reason for that is that the price for the organic product might be high or it might be low. During that illustration and that example, I also introduced a new concept, and that's the concept of a risk premium. Recall that a risk premium is the amount that a risk-averse person would pay to avoid taking a risk. What's important to recognize is that risk aversion is one of three possible types of preferences related to risk. There's two others. One is called risk neutrality, and the other is called risk preferring or risk loving behavior. People who are risk neutral are those whose marginal utility of wealth is constant. These are people who would be indifferent to taking a fair bet. A risk-neutral person would also be indifferent to growing a crop organically or conventionally in the other example. And the reason for that is that the expected value of the organic crop was identical to the expected value of the conventional crop. Now, what doesn't matter in this particular instance is risk. And in fact, a risk-neutral person chooses the option with the highest expected value because maximizing expected value maximizes their utility. The variance or the risk that they face doesn't enter into their decision to actually undertake a particular gamble or risky situation. Now we can illustrate a risk-neutral utility function using figure 6.2. This shows some of the numbers from the previous graph that I talked about in the lecture, but what I want you to recognize is that with a risk-neutral utility function, the utility of wealth is actually a straight line. That is to say, as wealth increases, utility increases, and it's got the same slope everywhere, regardless of the amount of wealth. This differs from risk-averse behavior, where utility increased in wealth, but it increased at a decreasing rate. There is diminishing marginal utility of wealth for a risk-averse person. For a risk-neutral person, this marginal utility is simply constant. I'll talk about the numbers in this slide in lecture on Friday, and as we work through the previous example that we had looked at, but assuming that the person who has to make the decision regarding a conventional versus organic crop is actually risk neutral. The other type of preference that we think about when it comes to risk are those people who are risk preferring, sometimes called risk loving individuals. An individual with an increasing marginal utility of wealth is risk preferring. These are people whose utility increases at an increasing rate in wealth. A risk preferring is also willing to pay for the right to make a fair bet. That is to say, they're attracted to the idea of a fair bet and they're willing to pay, if you want to think about it this way, a negative risk premium. Figure 6.3 illustrates a utility function for a risk preferring individual, and as you can see, utility is increasing at an increasing rate as wealth increases. So really what differentiates risk-averse versus risk-neutral and risk-preferring individuals is the shape of their utility function. If utility is increasing at a decreasing rate, you know you have a risk-averse person. If utility increases at a constant rate with wealth, then you know you have a risk-neutral person. If utility increases with at an increasing rate with wealth, then you have a risk-preferring individual. And again, you see a lot of numbers on this slide. I'm not going to talk about them in the video, but I will talk about them as we work through an example of the decision that someone would make regarding the conventional versus the organic crop had they been risk preferring rather than risk neutral or risk averse. Now, you might be wondering, well, okay, so how do we use this? How do we try to understand why this is important? And so one application you might want to think about is that most people say they don't like bearing risk, and consistent with that, they buy insurance. However, many of those people also gamble with unfair bets. That is, the expected value of the game is negative. And so you might wonder why. Well, if you're risk averse, buying insurance is a rational thing to do. You're paying a risk premium to eliminate some uncertainty. So for instance, if you buy fire insurance for your home, you'll pay the insurance company a risk premium, and what the insurance company promises to do is if your house burns down to basically buy you a new house. And so they've eliminated the risk associated with that occurrence of the fire burning your house down. People who buy that kind of house insurance or car insurance or life insurance, regardless of whether they're required to by law, also sometimes undertake unfair bets. And so you might be wondering, well, why are they undertaking these unfair bets? Well, it could be that there's a compulsion to gamble, that there's addicted to gambling, and if you follow what's been going on in the news in recent years, you'll actually see that there's a lot of concern regarding people who have problems with gambling. Another rationale for why seemingly rational people with respect to risk take on unfair bets is that gambling actually provides a form of entertainment. It generates utility in itself. And so it's not necessarily the utility of wealth that people are getting, but it's the utility of the entertainment associated with gambling that they're realizing. Taste can also be sometimes important in this. Some people place a high value on the chance of wealth increasing greatly, and they're willing to risk a loss in wealth if they also face a very high chance or any kind of chance of a large increase in wealth. And lastly, some people make mistakes. They just don't know the true probabilities, and they don't necessarily know that it's an unfair bet. They might think that going to a casino actually has got an advantage towards them, when in fact almost all casinos rig the odds against the people who are there gambling. Now, we've talked about risk, and we've talked about how to undertake decision analysis when you're faced with a risky situation, but how do you avoid risks? Because that's often something that's very important, certainly in businesses and in small enterprises, as people are concerned about trying to lessen the impact of any kind of risk or just avoiding risk in its entirety. And one way to avoid risk is to just say no. And the idea here is to abstain from optional risky activities, that is, risky activities that you don't have to engage in everyday life. For instance, don't buy lottery tickets, or don't go bungee jumping, or don't go tubing down the Grand River. But even when you can't avoid risk altogether, you can reduce the probability of bad states of nature or the size of any losses that might occur. So for instance, you might not be able to entirely avoid risk, but you might be able to minimize the impact of risk by maintaining your car as recommended, so taking it in for regular servicing, fixing components in your car when they're broken, putting a lock on your apartment door, or doing things like throwing out old newspapers in your house so that you don't have flammable material lying around that might ignite if there's a spark or if there's some kind of open flame. Another way to avoid risk is to obtain information. And in fact, the old adage that information is power is certainly true here. With information, you might be able to make a decision to avoid a risky choice, or you might be able to take actions that actually reduce the probability of the disaster or the size of the loss. And so the idea here is that you go out and seek information by a third party to give you more information about the probability of possible outcomes and the impact of possible outcomes. A great example of that is Consumers Report. In class, I'll talk about an example of this in the context of buying a car and how publications such as Consumers Report can put a lot of information into the hands of consumers and allow them to make a better choice. Other types of companies actually provide information that allow for the ranking or the rating of riskiness of different investment assets. Moody's and Standard & Poor's are two examples of companies that actually rate the riskiness not only of bonds but also of countries and companies in terms of their riskiness, or whether or not they've got a good credit record or a good credit history, and whether or not they're a company that's going to be one that you'd want to do business with, or perhaps one that has a high rate of default on a loan that you might give them. Two other ways of avoiding risk are to diversify and to insure. And really what we're talking about with diversification is don't put all your eggs into one basket. And the idea here is that if you face two potential options that you could invest in, what you'd like to do is find some options that are negatively correlated. That is, as the price of one goes up, the price of the other investment goes down. And what happens is that the risk associated with a decrease in the price of one is offset by the risk associated with the increase in the price of one. And so the concept of diversification to reduce risk is very important here. And we certainly see this in a lot of agricultural enterprises where producers don't just have one crop that they grow all the time or one type of enterprise. We see all sorts of mixed enterprises, and that's one way of diversifying away some risk. This is also true when you're dealing with personal financial investments. So some people will actually go out and invest in individual stocks. So for instance, they might buy stock in Research in Motion, or they might buy stock in PepsiCo. But for other people, they don't necessarily want to open themselves up to the risk of changes in the price of one stock, and so they buy what's called a mutual fund. And all a mutual fund is a collection of different individual stocks that have been put together in a way to try to reduce the amount of risk that an investor would face, while at the same time trying to ensure an adequate return. Insurance is also one way of avoiding risk. Now, it doesn't really avoid risk. What you do is you avoid the consequences of a risky outcome. And in the context of what we've been talking about, a risk-averse person is willing to pay money to avoid risk. That is, they're willing to pay a risk premium. The demand for risk reduction is often met by insurance, which bears the risk for anyone who buys an insurance policy. So the idea here is that what you do is you insure yourself against the consequences of the risk, not necessarily the risk itself. So the insurance policy doesn't eliminate the probability of your house catching on fire, but what it does is it lays out the conditions under which the insurance company would pay to build you a new house should there be a fire. The same thing with automobile insurance, the same thing with life insurance, that you're protecting yourself against financial loss should an undesirable event occur. And in exchange for that protection, you have to pay the insurance company a risk premium. That's all for now on this section of risk. We'll talk a little bit more about examples in class Friday, and then we'll carry on Monday of next week with a new section in the course.